Samantha Sam Rivera had spent the last 14 years behind the wheel of a truck, navigating the winding highways and treacherous roads that stretched across the country. She had seen all kinds of things on her long-haul trips: majestic sunrises, over desert highways, storm clouds rolling in like angry titans, and the occasional stranded motorist hoping for a kind soul to stop. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to encounter on this unusually warm autumn night. The harvest moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow across the Nebraska plains as Sam guided her 18-wheeler along. Route 83, the two-lane highway, stretched before her like a ribbon, unfurling into the darkness, empty save for the occasional passing car. Most nights, Sam welcomed the solitude. Tonight, something felt different. A strange tension in the air that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Sam adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her calloused hands testimony to years of hard work. At 42, she had the weathered face of someone who had spent too much time under the sun, laugh lines etched deeply around her eyes. The cab of her truck was meticulously organized, a small shrine to efficiency. Everything had its place. The thermos of black coffee. In its holder, the dog-eared road atlas tucked into the side compartment. The framed photo of her sister's family secured to the dashboard. The radio crackled with static, country music fading in and out as she passed through a patchy reception area. Sam reached over and turned the dial, searching for a clearer station. Her shift had started 12 hours ago in Kansas City, and she still had another 4 hours before she'd reach her destination in Rapid City. The shipping company had been pushing drivers harder lately, longer hours and tighter deadlines. Sam didn't mind the work. Driving was in her blood, but the fatigue was real, a constant companion on these overnight runs. A green highway sign flashed past. Broken Pine, 5 miles. Sam checked her fuel gauge. Still half a tank, but her bladder had other ideas. A quick pit stop wouldn't hurt, maybe grab another coffee for the road. She'd make up the time later. The small town of Broken Pine was barely visible from the highway, just a cluster of lights amid the vast darkness of the plains. Sam slowed as she approached the exit, her headlights illuminating the worn asphalt. The truck's engine rumbled as she downshifted, the familiar vibration traveling up through the seat. The Gas N Go station sat just off the highway, its fluorescent lights buzzing in the night. Sam maneuvered her rig into the oversized parking area reserved for trucks and semis. At this hour, she expected to be the only customer, but there was a single sedan parked near the entrance, its driver's door slightly ajar. Strange, Sam thought, as she shut off the engine. Who leaves their car door open like that? She climbed down from the cab, stretching her legs and rolling her shoulders to work out the kinks. 14 years on the road had taught her to listen to her instincts, and something about that car didn't feel right. Instead of heading straight for the convenience store, Sam walked toward the sedan. It was an older model Toyota, blue with a dented fender and a cracked taillight. The interior light was on, casting a weak glow across the empty front seat. Sam approached cautiously, one hand hovering near the pepper spray she kept clipped to her belt. "Hello, anyone here?" she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. No response. Sam peered inside the car. The keys were still in the ignition, and a smartphone lay abandoned on the passenger seat. A child's backpack sat on the floor, decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. Something cold settled in the pit of her stomach. That's when she noticed the faint marks in the gravel, what looked like drag marks, leading away from the car toward the back of the gas station. Sam's heart began to pound. She should just go inside, tell the cashier, mind her own business. But the empty car, the child's backpack, damn it, she muttered, pulling the small flashlight from her pocket and following the trail. The marks led her around the side of the building, past the dumpsters, and toward a small patch of scrubby grass that bordered the property. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, finally landing on a crumpled form lying motionless in the grass. "Oh my God," Sam gasped, rushing forward. It was a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, sprawled face down and completely still. He wore jeans and a faded red hoodie, one sneaker missing from his foot. Sam knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she gently rolled him onto his back. His face was pale in the flashlight's beam, a nasty bruise forming on his temple. Blood matted his sandy blonde hair, but the wound didn't look fresh. Sam pressed her fingers to his neck, relieved to find a steady pulse. "Hey, kid, can you hear me?" she said, lightly patting his cheek. No response. His skin felt cold to the touch, too cold for the mild night. How long had he been out here? Sam quickly shrugged off her jacket and wrapped it around the boy's thin shoulders. His breathing was shallow but steady. Probably a concussion, maybe worse. She needed to get help. As she shifted to stand, her hand brushed against something hard in the pocket of the boy's hoodie. Hesitating only a moment, Sam reached in and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It wasn't right to go through someone's things, but she needed to know who this kid was, if there was someone she could call. The wallet contained a school ID card, a library card, and a folded $5 bill. Sam squinted at the school ID, angling her flashlight to better read the name. Thomas Miller, Westridge Middle School. But it was what she found behind the school ID that made her blood run cold. A faded military ID card. The photo showed a younger man with the same sandy hair as the boy, wearing dress blues and a solemn expression. The name printed on the card, Staff Sergeant Andrew Miller, United States Army. Sam's hands trembled as she stared at the ID. It couldn't be. She knew that face, knew that name. Memories she'd spent years trying to forget came flooding back. The scorching heat of Afghanistan, the deafening explosion, the screams of her fellow soldiers. Staff Sergeant Andrew Miller had been her commanding officer during her second tour of duty. The man who had saved her life in Kandahar, pulling her from the burning transport vehicle after the IED hit. The man who had died doing it. Sam looked down at the unconscious boy with new understanding. This was Andrew's son. It had to be. The resemblance was unmistakable now that she saw it. But what was he doing out here alone? Where was his mother, and who had hurt him? The sound of an approaching vehicle snapped Sam back to the present. Headlights swept across the parking lot as a pickup truck pulled in, its engine growling in the quiet night. Something about the deliberate way it moved, slowly circling the sedan, set off warning bells in Sam's mind. Without fully understanding why, Sam gathered the boy into her arms. He was lighter than she expected and retreated further into the shadows behind the gas station. Her military training kicked in, assessing threats and calculating escape routes. Whoever was in that truck, they weren't here to help. Cradling Thomas against her chest, Sam watched as a man climbed out of the pickup. Even from this distance, she could see he was tall and powerfully built, with a shaved head and the rigid posture of someone used to authority. He approached the abandoned sedan, peered inside, then looked around the parking lot. When his gaze traveled toward the back of the gas station, Sam pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath. She didn't know what was happening, but her instincts were screaming at her to protect this boy, her fallen comrade's son. 14 years of trucking had taught her many things, but it was her military service that had prepared her for moments like this. Moments when you had to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. "I've got you, kid," she whispered to the unconscious Thomas. "Your dad had my back once. Now I've got yours." With the boy secure in her arms, Sam began to edge along the wall toward the back of the building, staying in the shadows. Her truck was on the other side of the lot. If she could reach it without being seen, they might have a chance. As she moved, Sam felt the weight of Staff Sergeant Miller's ID card in her pocket, a tangible connection to a past she had tried desperately to outrun. But some debts could never be repaid, some bonds never broken, and sometimes the road you're traveling brings you exactly where you need to be, whether you're ready for it or not. Sam's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept along the shadow of the gas station, the boy's weight growing heavier in her arms with each step. She paused at the corner of the building, peering cautiously around the edge. The man from the pickup was methodically searching the area around the abandoned sedan, his movements precise and controlled. Military, Sam thought, or law enforcement. Either way, her instincts told her he wasn't someone she wanted to encounter. The distance to her 18-wheeler seemed impossibly vast. 50 yards of open, illuminated parking lot with nowhere to hide. She'd have to time this perfectly. Taking a deep breath, Sam watched as the man disappeared around the far side of the gas station store. Now or never. She moved quickly but steadily, trying to balance speed with the need to keep Thomas stable. The boy's head lolled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow but consistent. Each step felt like an eternity, the gravel crunching too loudly beneath her boots, the harsh fluorescent lights exposing them completely. When she finally reached her truck, Sam fumbled one-handed with the door, struggling to maintain her grip on Thomas while accessing the cab. With a grunt of effort, she hoisted him up, laying him across the passenger seat before climbing in after him. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the ignition, sending up a silent prayer as the diesel engine rumbled to life. Through the side mirror, she caught a glimpse of movement. The man had heard the engine and was sprinting across the lot toward them, something glinting in his hand. A gun, a badge. Sam didn't wait to find out. She threw the truck into gear and pulled out of the parking lot, the tires spitting gravel as she accelerated onto the highway. "Hold on, Thomas," she murmured, glancing at the unconscious boy beside her. "We're getting out of here." The highway stretched dark and empty before them as Sam pushed the truck to its limits, the speedometer climbing past 70-80 miles per hour. Her mind raced faster than the truck, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why was Andrew Miller's son unconscious behind a gas station in the middle of nowhere? Who was the man pursuing them? And most importantly, what was she going to do now? She checked her mirrors obsessively, looking for headlights gaining on them, but the road behind remained dark. After 10 miles of hard driving, Sam allowed herself to ease off the accelerator slightly, her breath coming in shaky gasps as adrenaline continued to surge through her system. A soft groan from the passenger seat snapped her attention back to Thomas. The boy was stirring, his eyelids fluttering as he began to regain consciousness. Hey, take it easy," Sam said, keeping one hand on the wheel while reaching out to steady him. "You're safe now." Thomas's eyes opened, confusion and fear immediately filling his gaze as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. He jerked upright, then winced, his hand flying to the bruise on his temple. Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear as he pressed himself against the passenger door. "Where am I?" "My name is Sam, Samantha Rivera," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "I found you unconscious behind a gas station back in Broken Pine. You're in my truck now. I'm trying to help you." The boy's eyes darted around the cab, his breath coming in rapid, panicked bursts. "Pull over," he demanded. "I need to get out, now!" "I can't do that, Thomas," Sam said, the use of his name causing the boy to freeze. "There was someone looking for you back there, someone dangerous." His face paled further. "How do you know my name?" Sam hesitated, then nodded toward the dashboard where she'd placed his wallet. "I checked your ID. I needed to know who you were. If there was someone I could call." She paused, then added softly, "I also found your father's military ID." At the mention of his father, Thomas's expression crumpled, a complex mixture of grief, fear, and something else. Something that looked like guilt washing over his features. "You knew my dad?" he whispered. Sam nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I served with him in Afghanistan. He was my commanding officer during my second tour." She swallowed hard. "He saved my life." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. Finally, his shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "He died a hero," he said flatly, as if repeating a line he'd heard 1,000 times. "Yes," Sam agreed softly. "He did." She paused, then asked gently, "Thomas, what happened to you? Who hurt you, and why were you alone out there?" The boy turned away, staring out the window at the darkness rushing past. For a moment, Sam thought he wouldn't answer, but then he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the rumble of the engine. "It's my stepdad," he said. "Frank. He married my mom 2 years after Dad died. At first, he was okay, but then Mom got sick. Cancer." His voice caught on the word. "She died 6 months ago. After that, Frank changed. He started drinking a lot and he'd get angry about everything. He hit me sometimes." Sam's grip tightened on the steering wheel, anger flaring hot in her chest. "Is he the one who did this to you?" she asked, gesturing toward the bruise on his temple. Thomas nodded. "Yesterday I found some papers in his office, financial stuff. It looks like he's been stealing my dad's military benefits, the money that was supposed to be for me and Mom. When I confronted him, he went crazy." The boy's voice shook. He said nobody would believe me, that he'd tell everyone I was troubled, making things up for attention. Then he hit me. I don't remember much after that. "So you ran," Sam concluded, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "When I woke up, I took his car and just drove," Thomas confirmed. "I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him. I was trying to reach my grandma in South Dakota, but I got lost. And then I started feeling really dizzy." At the gas station, he looked at her with sudden alarm. "Frank must have followed me. That man back there, that was him, wasn't it?" Sam nodded grimly. "I think so. Big guy, shaved head, moves like he's used to giving orders." "That's him," Thomas whispered, fear evident in his voice. "He was a police officer in Chicago before we moved to Kansas. That's why I was afraid to go to the authorities. Who would believe me over him?" A cold realization settled in Sam's stomach. If Frank was law enforcement, even former law enforcement, he'd have resources, connections. Right now, in his eyes, She wasn't a good Samaritan. She was a kidnapper taking his stepson across state lines. And if Thomas was right about the financial fraud, Frank had every reason to silence them both. "Do you have any other family besides your grandmother?" Sam asked, her mind racing through their limited options. Thomas shook his head. "Just Grandma Helen in Rapid City, Mom's mom. But I haven't seen her in years. Frank wouldn't let us visit after Mom died." Sam felt a chill run down her spine at the coincidence. Rapid City, the very destination she'd been heading to before all this began. Was it fate or just dumb luck? Either way, it gave them a clear objective. "That's where we're going," she decided. Aloud, "That's where my delivery is headed anyway. We'll get you to your grandmother, and she can help us contact the proper authorities about Frank." For the first time, a glimmer of hope appeared in Thomas's eyes. "You'd do that for me? Why?" Sam was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the dark highway ahead. The memories she'd kept buried for so long resurfaced. The blinding flash of the explosion, the searing heat, Andrew Miller's voice shouting orders as he pulled her from the wreckage, his final words to her before he went back for the others. "Because your father wouldn't have left you behind," she said finally, "and neither will I." Thomas fell silent, absorbing her words. After a few minutes, his eyelids began to droop, exhaustion overcoming fear and adrenaline. Sam glanced over, concern furrowing her brow. With his concussion, she wasn't sure if letting him sleep was safe. "Hey, try to stay awake if you can," she urged. "With that head injury, it's better if you stay conscious for a while." Thomas nodded drowsily, fighting to keep his eyes open. "Tell me about my dad," he requested softly. "Tell me something I don't know. Something not in the official reports." Sam took a deep breath, memories washing over her like waves. There was so much she could tell him. Andrew's terrible singing voice that had nevertheless boosted morale during the darkest nights. His collection of plastic dinosaurs he kept in his footlocker as good luck charms. The way he could diffuse tension with a single well-placed joke. "Did you know he had a lucky penny?" she began, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Carried it everywhere. Said his grandfather gave it to him when he was about your age." As Sam shared stories about Andrew Miller with his son, the truck ate up the miles of empty highway, carrying them toward Rapid City. But Sam knew the journey was far from over. Frank wouldn't give up easily, especially with so much at stake. And he wasn't the only threat they faced. Morning would bring new challenges. Frank would report his car and stepson missing. Sam would miss her delivery deadline. Questions would be asked. Alerts would go out. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of her truck cab, surrounded by darkness and guided by the distant stars, Sam felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Staff Sergeant Andrew Miller had given his life to save hers. Now, years later, fate had given her the chance to repay that debt by protecting his son. Whatever came next, she wouldn't let him down. The first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in pale washes of pink and gold as Sam's truck rumbled past the South Dakota state line. They'd been driving for nearly 4 hours, stopping only once at a 24-hour truck stop where Sam had bought Thomas a sandwich, some ibuprofen for his headache, and a burner phone with a prepaid card. Better to be cautious, she'd reasoned. If Frank was indeed former law enforcement, he might have ways to track Thomas's regular phone. "How's your head feeling?" Sam asked, glancing at the boy who had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep about an hour earlier. She'd kept him awake as long as possible, concerned about the concussion. but eventually his exhaustion had won out. Thomas stirred at her voice, blinking groggily. "Still hurts," he admitted, touching the bruise on his temple gingerly. "But not as bad as before. We'll get you checked out properly once we reach your grandmother's," Sam promised. "Just another couple of hours." Thomas nodded, sitting up straighter and looking out at the lightening landscape. The flat plains of Nebraska had given way to the rolling hills of South Dakota, the terrain becoming more dramatic with each passing mile. "Do you think Frank's still following us?" he asked quietly, scanning the road behind them. Sam checked her mirrors for what felt like the 100th time. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "We haven't seen that pickup since Broken Pine, but that doesn't mean he's given up." She didn't voice her deeper concerns, that Frank might have alerted authorities, possibly filing a kidnapping report. With his background in law enforcement, he would know exactly how to work the system. The thought of highway patrol pulling them over made her stomach clench. How would she explain the situation without sounding like the very kidnapper Frank might have portrayed her as? "I need to call my grandmother," Thomas said suddenly. "She doesn't even know I'm coming." Sam frowned. "Use the burner phone, but keep it brief. We don't know if Frank has been monitoring your grandmother's calls, especially if he suspected you. Might contact her." Thomas dug the cheap phone from his pocket and hesitated. "I don't actually know her number by heart," he admitted sheepishly. "It's always just been in my contacts." Sam thought for a moment. "Do you remember her address at least?" Thomas nodded. 1422 Pinecrest Drive, Rapid City. She's lived there my whole life." "Good," Sam said, her mind working through their options. "We'll find it, but first, let's make a stop. I need to drop off this shipment, or my company's going to report the truck stolen." She pulled into a rest area and parked, reaching for her company phone to call her dispatcher. Thomas watched nervously as she dialed. "Hey, dispatch, it's Rivera," she said when the call connected. "Just checking in. I'm about 2 hours from the delivery point in Rapid City." The voice on the other end was gruff, but not unfriendly. "You're running behind schedule, Rivera. Everything okay?" Sam took a deep breath. "Had a bit of trouble with the rig outside of Broken Pine. Nothing major, just needed to let the engine cool down for a while. I'll make the delivery, but I might be an hour or so late." There was a pause on the other end. "All right, I'll let the client know, but this is the 3rd late delivery this month, Rivera. Boss isn't happy." "Understood," Sam replied, her jaw tightening. "Won't happen again." She ended the call and exhaled slowly. One problem temporarily addressed, but her boss's displeasure was the least of her concerns right now. "Are you going to get in trouble?" Thomas asked, worry creasing his forehead. Sam shrugged. "Probably, but it doesn't matter. Getting you safely to your grandmother is what's important." Thomas looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Why are you doing all this for me? You don't even know me." Sam was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I knew your father," she said finally. "That's enough." She started the engine again. "Besides, what was I supposed to do? Leave you lying there?" As they pulled back onto the highway, neither of them noticed the dark sedan parked at the far end of the rest area, nor the man inside speaking rapidly into a phone, his eyes never leaving Sam's truck as it disappeared around the bend. The warehouse district on the outskirts of Rapid City was quiet as Sam maneuvered her truck through the narrow access roads. Her delivery, industrial machine parts for a manufacturing plant, was routine, and she hoped to complete it quickly. "Stay in the truck," she instructed Thomas as she pulled up to the loading dock. "Keep your head down. I'll be as fast as I can." The boy nodded, sliding down in his seat to remain out of sight. Sam grabbed her clipboard and jumped down from the cab, her work boots hitting the concrete with a solid thump. The warehouse manager was already waiting, clipboard in hand, a look of mild irritation on his weathered face. "You're late, Rivera," he noted, checking his watch. "Almost 2 hours." "Had some engine trouble," Sam replied smoothly, handing over the delivery manifest. "Nothing serious, but it slowed me down. Everything's there, counts all correct." The manager grunted, signaling to his workers to begin unloading. Sam stood by, watching the forklift operators efficiently transferring pallets from her trailer into the warehouse. Every few minutes she glanced back at her truck, ensuring Thomas remained hidden and that no unfamiliar vehicles had entered the loading area. The unloading took 35 minutes. 35 minutes of Sam standing on edge, fighting the urge to rush the workers. When the manager finally signed off on the delivery, she thanked him and strode quickly back to her truck, relief washing over her as she saw Thomas still safely hunched in the passenger seat. "All done," she announced, climbing in. "Now let's find your grandmother." Thomas sat up, his expression brightening slightly. "You're really going to take me there? Right now?" "That's the plan," Sam confirmed, starting the engine. She hesitated, then added, "But Thomas, you need to be prepared. Your grandmother might not recognize you right away. It's been years, and kids change a lot in that time. Plus, we're showing up unannounced with a pretty wild story." The boy's face fell slightly. "You think she won't believe us?" "I think," Sam said carefully, "that we need to be patient and give her time to process everything. And we need to be careful. If Frank has been monitoring her, he might expect you to go there." Thomas nodded solemnly. "What should we do?" "First, we need to clean up a bit. You can't show up looking like you've been in a fight and I could use a fresh shirt myself." Sam pulled back onto the main road. "Then we'll approach carefully. No barging in, no scene. We need to make sure it's safe." 20 minutes later, they had stopped at a small department store where Sam purchased a new shirt for Thomas to replace his blood-stained hoodie, some basic first aid supplies, and a baseball cap to help conceal his bruised face. In the store's restroom, she helped him clean up, gently wiping away dried blood and applying antiseptic to the cut on his temple. "You said my dad saved your life," Thomas said as Sam carefully placed a bandage over the worst of his injury. "How?" Sam's hands stilled for a moment. She hadn't planned to go into detail, had hoped the brief explanation she'd given earlier would be enough, but the earnestness in Thomas's eyes, so like his father's, made her reconsider. "We were transporting supplies to a forward operating base," she began, continuing her work on his wound. "Standard route we'd taken dozens of times. Before, your dad was leading the convoy. I was driving the third vehicle." She took a deep breath. "The IED hit my transport, flipped it completely. I was pinned inside, couldn't move my legs. The fuel tank was ruptured and fire was spreading fast." Thomas listened completely still as Sam continued. "Your father was in the lead vehicle. Well, ahead of the blast. Protocol said they should secure the perimeter, call for backup and wait. But Andrew, your dad, he ran back. Through gunfire, through the chaos, he pulled me out just before the fuel tank exploded." Sam's voice grew quiet. "He went back for the others. There were 3 more soldiers in my transport. He managed to get 2 out, was going back for the 3rd when..." She trailed off, the memory still too painful even after all these years. "I know that part," Thomas said softly. "They told us he died saving his men, that he put himself in danger to protect others." Sam nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "That was who he was," she finally managed. It wasn't just that day. It was every day. He led from the front, never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. She finished with the bandage and stepped back. "How's that feel?" "Better," Thomas said, examining his reflection in the mirror. The baseball cap shadowed his face, making the bruise less noticeable unless someone was looking closely. "Do you think this will work?" "It'll have to," Sam replied, checking her watch. "We should go. It's almost 10. Your grandmother should be up by now." As they walked back to the truck, Sam scanned the parking lot, a habit that had become second nature in the past few hours. Nothing seemed out of place, but the knot of tension in her stomach refused to ease. Frank was still out there, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Thomas directed her through the residential streets of Rapid City, the neighborhoods growing more established and tree-lined as they moved away from the commercial district. Finally, they turned onto Pinecrest Drive, a quiet street lined with modest but well-maintained homes. Thomas pointed to a small blue house with white trim and a neatly tended garden. "That's it," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "That's my grandma's house." Sam parked the truck a few houses down, not wanting to draw immediate attention. "Wait, here a minute," she instructed. "Let me check things out first." She walked casually past the house, noting the lace curtains in the front window, the garden hose coiled neatly beside the porch, the absence of newspapers or mail piling up. All signs pointed to someone being home and following their regular routine. No unfamiliar vehicles were parked in the driveway or on the street nearby. So far, so good. Sam returned to the truck, feeling cautiously optimistic. "Looks quiet. I think we're okay to approach, but let's be smart about this. I'll go with you to the door, but you should be the one she sees first." Thomas nodded, taking a deep breath as he climbed down from the cab. Together, they walked toward the blue house, Sam slightly behind Thomas, her eyes constantly scanning the street for any sign of trouble. As they reached the front walk, the door suddenly opened and an elderly woman stepped out onto the porch, a watering can in her hand. She froze when she saw them, her eyes widening as they fixed on Thomas. "Tommy," she whispered, the watering can slipping from her fingers and clattering on the porch floor. "Is that you?" The moment of truth had arrived. Grandma Helen. Thomas rushed forward, nearly tripping on the front steps in his haste to reach his grandmother. The elderly woman's hands flew to her mouth, tears immediately welling in her eyes as she opened her arms to receive him. Sam hung back, watching the reunion with a lump in her throat. Helen Miller couldn't have been younger than 70. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her slender frame belying a strength evident in the way she clutched her grandson to her chest. For a long moment, the two simply held each other, Helen's shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Finally, she pulled back, her weathered hands framing Thomas's face as she studied him. "Let me look at you," she whispered. "My God, how you've grown." Then, her expression changed as she noticed the bandage on his temple, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Tommy, what happened? Are you hurt, and who?" Her gaze shifted to Sam, standing awkwardly at the bottom of the porch steps. "Who are you?" Before Sam could answer, Thomas spoke. "Grandma, this is Sam, Samantha Rivera. She saved me. She served with Dad in Afghanistan." Helen's eyes widened, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. Surprise, confusion, and something that looked like recognition. "Please," she said after a moment, gathering herself, Both of you come inside. It's not safe to talk out here. Sam felt a chill run down her spine at the woman's words. Not safe. Helen knew something, sensed something. The three of them hurried into the house, Helen locking the door behind them with trembling hands. The interior of Helen's home was exactly what Sam might have expected. Comfortable furniture worn with use, crocheted Afghans draped over armchairs, and framed photographs covering nearly every surface. Many showed a younger Thomas with his parents, including several of Andrew in his military uniform. Sam's eyes lingered on one photo, Andrew in desert fatigues, his arms slung around the shoulders of a much younger Sam, both of them squinting against the Afghan sun. She hadn't known Helen had that picture. "You'll have to excuse the mess," Helen said automatically, though the house was immaculate. "I wasn't expecting company." She gestured for them to sit in the living room, but remained standing herself, her hands fidgeting with her cardigan. "Now, someone needs to tell me what's going on. Tommy, why are you injured? Where's Frank? And how did you end up with," she glanced at Sam, "with Ms. Rivera?" Thomas looked at Sam, uncertainty in his eyes. She nodded encouragingly, and he took a deep breath. "Frank hurt me, Grandma," he said quietly. "He's been hurting me for a while now, ever since Mom died." Helen's face drained of color, her legs seeming to give out as she sank into an armchair. "Oh, Tommy," she whispered. "I was afraid of something like this. Your mother would call me sometimes when he wasn't home. She said things had changed, that Frank wasn't the man she'd married. But she was so sick, so dependent on him." Her voice broke. "After she passed, he wouldn't let me see you. Said you needed stability, not an old woman filling your head with stories about your father." She looked up at Sam, her eyes sharp despite her age. "And how do you come into this?" Sam leaned forward, her hands clasped between her knees. "I found Thomas unconscious behind a gas station in Broken Pine, Nebraska. He was injured, alone. When I checked his wallet for ID, I found his father's military card." She swallowed. "Andrew Miller saved my life in Afghanistan. When I realized this was his son, I couldn't leave him there." Helen nodded slowly, studying Sam with a penetrating gaze. "Andrew spoke of you in his letters, the stubborn mechanic who could fix anything, who always volunteered for the most dangerous convoy runs." Sam felt her chest tighten at the thought that Andrew had written home about her. "I didn't know." "Grandma," Thomas interjected urgently, "there's more. Frank's been stealing Dad's military benefits, the money that was supposed to be for me. And Mom, I found the papers. When I confronted him about it, he lost it. That's when he hit me." Helen's expression hardened, a flash of anger replacing the sorrow in her eyes. "I suspected something like that too. Your mother's medical bills were enormous, but there should have been insurance, benefits. Frank always claimed it wasn't enough, that they were drowning in debt." She paused, then asked, "Did you bring these papers with you?" Thomas shook his head regretfully. "I couldn't. I just ran. Took his car and drove until I started feeling really dizzy and had to stop at that gas station." He looked at Sam. "That's where Sam found me, and Frank found us. He followed me there." Helen's hand flew to her throat. "Frank knows you're gone? He's looking for you." Her eyes darted to the windows, as if expecting to see him lurking outside. "Yes," Sam confirmed grimly. "He was at the gas station. I got Thomas out before he found us, but he's definitely looking. And with his law enforcement background, he would have reported the car stolen." Helen finished the thought. "And possibly filed a missing person report for Thomas, or worse, claimed he was kidnapped." She looked at Sam with new concern. You've put yourself in a very dangerous position, Ms. Rivera. Sam shrugged. I couldn't leave him there. Helen studied her for a moment, then nodded, as if confirming something to herself. No, I don't suppose Andrew's friend could have done anything else. She stood up with sudden determination. Well, you're both here now, and we need a plan. First things first. Tommy, you need proper medical attention for that head injury. We can't go to a hospital, Sam objected immediately. If Frank has reported Thomas missing, that's the first place they'll check. Helen smiled thinly. I worked as a nurse for 43 years before retiring. I have friends. Give me a minute. She moved to the kitchen, picking up the phone and turning her back to them as she dialed. While Helen made her call, Sam moved to the window, carefully peering out between the lace curtains. The street remained quiet, peaceful in the late morning sun. No sign of Frank's pickup or any other suspicious vehicles, but Sam knew better than to let her guard down. If Frank had indeed filed reports, local law enforcement would be involved by now. They needed to move fast. Helen returned a few minutes later, her expression resolute. My friend Patricia is a retired ER doctor. She's going to come by and check. Tommy's injury, she won't report anything. She looked at Thomas. In the meantime, young man, you need to eat something. You look half-starved. Despite the tension of the situation, Sam couldn't help but smile as Helen bustled into the kitchen, opening cabinets and pulling out ingredients with the efficiency of someone used to taking charge in a crisis. It reminded her of her own grandmother. Long gone now, Thomas followed his grandmother, seemingly relieved to have a moment of normalcy amid the chaos. Sam remained vigilant by the window, watching the street. Ms. Rivera. Sam, Helen called from the kitchen. You must be hungry too. Come, sit. We need to talk while we wait for Patricia. Sam hesitated, torn between her guard duty and the genuine warmth in Helen's invitation. Finally, her rumbling stomach made the decision for her. She hadn't eaten a proper meal since before finding Thomas. The kitchen was bright and cheerful, yellow curtains framing a window that overlooked a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Helen moved with practiced ease, assembling sandwiches and heating soup, while Thomas set the table. The domesticity of the scene struck Sam forcefully, a stark contrast to the tension and danger that had brought them here. Tommy, there's apple juice in the fridge, Helen directed, then turned to Sam. Coffee, please, Sam said gratefully, accepting the steaming mug Helen placed before her a moment later. As they ate, Helen's expression grew serious again. We need to think about our next steps. Frank will be looking for both of you, and he has resources we don't. We need evidence, Sam said between bites of the best chicken salad sandwich she'd had in years. Without those financial papers Thomas mentioned, it's his word against Frank's. And Frank was a cop. He'll be believed. Not necessarily, Helen said, a shrewd look in her eyes. I've been keeping my own records. When Julia, Tommy's mother, first got sick, I offered to help manage their finances. Frank refused rather aggressively, but Julia secretly sent me copies of some bank statements, insurance documents. She was worried about what might happen if she... Helen swallowed hard. If she didn't make it. Thomas looked up, surprise clear on his face. Mom never told me that. She was protecting you, sweetheart, Helen said gently. She didn't want to worry you or create more tension with Frank. She was very ill, very vulnerable. She turned to Sam. The documents aren't comprehensive, but they show some discrepancies. Money coming in from the military benefits that doesn't appear in their household accounts. It might be enough to trigger a proper investigation. Sam nodded thoughtfully. That's a start, but we need to be careful about how we proceed. If Frank suspects we're building a case against him... A sharp knock at the front door interrupted her. All three of them froze, exchanging alarmed glances. That'll be Patricia, Helen said. Though she didn't sound entirely confident, she moved to the living room window and carefully peeked out. Yes, it's her car. I'll let her in. Sam stood, positioning herself where she could see the front door, but remain partially hidden. Her hand instinctively went to her side, though the gesture was futile. She had no weapon beyond the small pocket knife she always carried. Helen opened the door to admit a tall, angular woman with short grey hair and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. Dr. Patricia Clark carried a black medical bag and an air of brisk efficiency that immediately filled the small house. "Helen," she greeted with a nod, then looked past her friend to where Thomas sat at the kitchen table. "And this must be your grandson. Let's have a look at that head injury, young man." As Patricia examined Thomas, her experienced hands gentle but thorough, Sam found herself relaxing slightly. The doctor asked no unnecessary questions, simply focusing on her patient with professional detachment. Finally, she straightened up. "Minor concussion," she pronounced. "The cut is shallow, already healing well. Keep an eye on him for the next 24 hours. Any vomiting, severe headache, confusion, take him to the ER immediately. Otherwise, rest and over-the-counter pain relievers should suffice." She handed Helen a small bottle from her bag. "This ointment will help with the bruising." Patricia packed up her supplies, then fixed Helen with a serious look. "I don't need to know the details, but I recognize a situation when I see one. If you need anything else, call me, day or night." Helen embraced her friend briefly. "Thank you, Patricia. I owe you." After the doctor left, the three of them gathered again in the living room, the brief medical interlude having provided a moment to collect their thoughts. "Here's what we're going to do," Helen said decisively. "I'm going to gather all the financial documents I have. Sam, you'll take Thomas and these documents to the state police headquarters in Pierre, not the local police. We can't risk Frank having contacts there. Tommy will file a formal complaint of abuse and financial fraud, with the documents as evidence, and the visible injury they'll have to investigate." She turned to Thomas, taking his hands in hers. "It won't be easy, sweetheart. You'll have to tell your story, probably multiple times. They might not believe you immediately, but I'll be with you every step of the way, and so will Sam if she's willing." Sam nodded without hesitation. "Of course I am." Helen smiled gratefully, then continued. "The drive to Pierre will take about 3 hours. We should leave soon before Frank thinks to check here." She paused, her expression troubled. "Unless he already has." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implication of her words sank in. If Frank had already checked Helen's house and found it empty, he might be watching, waiting for them to appear. Sam moved to the window again, scanning the street with renewed vigilance. And this time, she saw it. A dark sedan parked half a block away, a lone figure sitting in the driver's seat. "I think we may have a problem," she said quietly. "We have company." Helen and Thomas joined Sam at the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtains. The dark sedan remained in place, its engine off, the driver motionless behind the wheel. "Is it Frank?" Thomas whispered, his voice tight with fear. Sam squinted, trying to make out the figure in the vehicle. "Can't tell from here, but whoever it is, they're watching the house." Helen's lips thinned into a determined line. "We need a closer... Look, there's a pair of binoculars in the hall closet, Andrew's old ones." She moved away from the window and returned moments later with a well-worn pair of military-grade binoculars. Sam accepted them gratefully, adjusting the focus as she peered through the curtains. "It's not Frank," she said after a moment, relief evident in her voice. "Different build, younger, but he's definitely watching the house." Helen frowned. Frank could have hired someone, or it could be a police officer in an unmarked car. "Either way, we're not walking out the front door," Sam concluded, lowering the binoculars. "Is there another way out?" Helen nodded. "The back garden connects to the alley. We could go through there, but we'd still need transportation. My car is in the front driveway." "And my truck is parked down the street," Sam added. "Whoever's watching would see us approach either vehicle." Thomas, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "What about Mrs. Winters next door? She always liked Mom. Maybe she'd help us." Helen considered this, then nodded slowly. "Edith Winters has never been fond of Frank. She might be willing to let us use her back door, maybe even her car." "It's worth a try," Sam agreed. "But we need to move quickly before our friend out there gets suspicious or calls for backup." Helen moved to the kitchen, pulling out a large tote bag and beginning to fill it with essentials. The financial documents she'd mentioned, some food, a first aid kit, a change of clothes for Thomas that she kept in a drawer for his visits that had never happened. "I have cash in the safe," she said, moving to a small landscape painting on the wall and swinging it aside to reveal a hidden compartment. $5,000. Julia sent it to me in installments, afraid that Frank might be monitoring her accounts. She wanted to make sure Tommy would have something if... She trailed off, focusing on the combination lock. Sam watched with growing respect. Helen Miller was proving to be remarkably prepared for a crisis. Her practical efficiency reminiscent of many senior NCOs Sam had served with. "Mrs. Winters' house. Can we reach it from the backyard without being seen from the street?" Sam asked, her mind already mapping potential routes. Helen nodded, retrieving an envelope of cash from the safe and adding it to the tote bag. "There's a gate in the back fence, hidden by the raspberry bushes. We've used it for years. Edith and I share a garden plot." "Perfect," Sam said. "Here's the plan. We'll go through the backyard to Mrs. Winters. If she's willing to help, we borrow her car and take the alley out to Maple Street, avoiding our watcher completely. We head straight for Pierre and the state police." Helen zipped, the tote bag closed with a decisive motion. "And if Edith can't or won't help?" Sam's expression hardened. "Then we improvise. But we're getting Thomas out of here one way or another." The tension in the room was palpable as they prepared to move. Thomas looked pale but determined, staying close to his grandmother as she made final preparations. Sam checked the windows once more, confirming that their observer remained in place, seemingly unaware of their plans. "Ready?" Sam asked, meeting Helen's eyes. The older woman nodded, her jaw set. "Tommy, stay between us. If anything happens, you run, understand? Don't wait for me or Sam." Thomas looked like he wanted to protest, but he nodded reluctantly. "Yes, ma'am." They moved through the kitchen to the back door, Sam leading the way, scanning the yard for any sign of surveillance. The garden was lush with summer growth, vegetable plants and flowers providing additional cover as they made their way to the fence line. Helen pointed to a nearly invisible gate, half hidden by a riot of raspberry canes, their branches heavy with ripening fruit. Sam eased the gate open, wincing at the slight creak of the hinges. Edith Winter's yard was similarly well tended, with neat rows of flowers and a small patio set beneath a maple tree. The back of her modest bungalow featured a screen door leading into a sunroom. "Let me go first," Helen whispered. "She knows." "Me?" Sam nodded, keeping Thomas close as Helen approached the house and knocked softly on the screen door. Long seconds passed with no response. Helen knocked again, slightly louder. Finally, the inner door opened, revealing a petite woman with cloud white hair styled in an elegant bob. She blinked in surprise at the three figures on her patio. "Helen? What on earth? Edith! I'm sorry to surprise you like this, but we need your help," Helen said quietly. "It's an emergency. May we come in?" Mrs. Winters's gaze moved from Helen to Thomas, her eyes widening in recognition, then to Sam, whom she clearly didn't know. After a moment's hesitation, she pushed the screen door open. "Of course, come in quickly," she said, ushering them into her sunroom. "Is that Tommy? My goodness, how you've grown." Once inside, Helen made rapid introductions and explained their situation in terse, efficient sentences. Mrs. Winters listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "I never did trust that man," she said, when Helen finished. "The way he looked at people, like he was measuring them up. And after Julia passed, the way he isolated you both." She shook her head, then straightened her shoulders. "Of course I'll help. What do you need?" "Your car," Helen said without preamble, "and to leave through your front door if possible. There's someone watching my house from the street." "Take it," Mrs. Winters said immediately, retrieving her keys from a hook by the door. "It's the blue Buick in the carport. Full tank of gas. I just filled it yesterday." She hesitated. "Should I call the police after you've gone?" Sam and Helen exchanged glances. "No," Sam said firmly. "The man we're dealing with has connections in law enforcement. We're going directly to the state police in Pierre, but we need time to get there first." Mrs. Winters nodded, accepting this without question. "I understand. Wait here a moment." She disappeared into the main part of the house, returning shortly with a small object that she pressed into Thomas's hand. "A good luck charm," she explained. "My late husband's St. Christopher medal, the patron saint of travelers. Keep it with you." Thomas looked down at the small silver medallion, then impulsively hugged the elderly woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters." "You be safe now," she replied, patting his shoulder. "All of you and Helen." She turned to her friend. "When this is over, you bring this boy back for a proper visit. I've got years of birthday cakes to make up for." Helen embraced her briefly. "You'll be the first to know when we're back. Thank you, Edith." With the keys to Mrs. Winters' Buick in hand, they moved through her house to the front door. Sam peered cautiously through the peephole, relieved to see that from this vantage point, the dark sedan watching Helen's house was not visible. That hopefully meant they weren't visible to its occupant either. "Stay close to the hedge line," Sam instructed as they prepared to exit. "Move naturally, not too fast. If anyone asks, we're just driving Mrs. Winters to a doctor's appointment." They stepped out onto Mrs. Winters' front porch, then walked with deliberate casualness to the carport where the blue Buick sat waiting. Sam took the driver's seat, with Helen beside her and Thomas in the back, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. As Sam backed the car out of the driveway, she scanned the street in both directions. The dark sedan remained in place, its driver apparently unaware of their escape. She turned the Buick in the opposite direction, maintaining a steady, unhurried pace until they reached the corner. "I think we're clear," she said, allowing herself a small exhale of relief as they turned onto Maple Street. "Now we just need to reach the highway without being spotted." Helen nodded, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. "Take Jackson Avenue to the bypass. It's less direct, but there's less chance of being seen from my street." Sam followed her directions, navigating through residential neighborhoods until they reached the highway on-ramp. As they accelerated onto the open road, Thomas let out an audible sigh. "Did we really make it?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Don't celebrate yet," Sam cautioned, checking the rearview mirror for what felt like the 100th time. "We've still got 3 hours to Pierre, and Frank will figure out we've gone once his watcher reports that there's been no movement at your grandmother's house." Helen turned to look at her grandson in the back seat. "How are you feeling, Tommy?" "Is your head hurting?" "A little," he admitted. "But I'm okay, Grandma, just scared." "That's only natural," she assured him. "But we're going to fix this. All of it." She glanced at Sam. "We have help now." Sam kept her eyes on the road, her mind racing through contingencies. They had escaped the immediate threat, but they were far from safe. Frank likely had a description of her truck, possibly even the license plate number. He might have filed reports claiming Thomas had been kidnapped. And if he was monitoring police channels, he might already be aware that they were on the move. "We need to contact the state police before we arrive," she said aloud. "Give them a heads up about our situation. Make sure Frank hasn't already spun a story that would get us detained the moment we walk in." Helen pulled the burner phone from her bag. "I know someone we can call. Judge Michael Reeves. He and Andrew grew up together. He's retired now, but he still has connections." Sam nodded. "Perfect. See if he can arrange for us to meet directly. With someone in authority. Someone who won't be easily influenced by Frank's credentials." As Helen made the call, speaking in low, urgent tones to an old family friend, Sam maintained vigilant watch on the road around them. Every vehicle that approached caused her to tense, especially the occasional police car or dark sedan. Thomas leaned forward from the back seat. "Sam, what happens after we talk to the state police? Will they arrest Frank right away?" Sam met his eyes in the rearview mirror, wanting to be honest but not alarm him further. "It's not that simple, Thomas. There will be an investigation. They'll need to verify your story, examine the evidence. It might take time. And what about me? Will I have to go back to Frank while they investigate?" The fear in his voice was palpable. Before Sam could respond, Helen ended her call and turned around to face her grandson. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "Judge Reeves is arranging for emergency custody to be granted to me, effective immediately. You'll stay with me, Thomas. Frank won't be allowed near you while the investigation is ongoing." The relief on Thomas's face was immediate and profound. "Really? You promise?" "I promise," Helen said, reaching back to squeeze his hand. "I've been fighting to see you for 2 years. I'm not letting you go again." She turned back to Sam. "Michael says we should meet him directly at the courthouse in Pierre. He's calling ahead to arrange for a detective from the state police and a representative from Child Protective Services to meet us there. We'll make formal statements and file the necessary paperwork all at once." Sam nodded, impressed with the efficiency of Helen's connections. "That's good. Very good. How long until he can meet us?" 2 hours. He's driving in from his lake house." "Perfect," Sam said, calculating their arrival time. "That gives us just enough time to get there." She paused, then added more softly, "And what about after? What happens to Thomas then? Helen's expression softened. He stays with me, of course, where he belongs. This house Frank moved them to after Julia died. It was never home for Tommy. His home is with family who love him. Thomas remained quiet in the back seat, but Sam could see the emotions playing across his face in the rearview mirror. Relief, hope, and lingering fear that somehow everything might still fall apart. "It's going to be okay," she told him with more confidence than she truly felt. "Your father always said that doing the right thing might not be easy, but it was always worth it." He was right. The miles rolled away beneath them as they continued toward Pierre, the prairie landscape flowing past like a golden sea under the midday sun. None of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Sam maintained a careful speed, not too fast to attract attention, not too slow to delay their arrival. Her military training had taught her that the moments of apparent safety were often the most dangerous. When vigilance waned and mistakes happened, she wouldn't let down her guard, not until Thomas was officially under his grandmother's protection. And Frank was facing investigation. She owed that much to Andrew Miller and to herself. As they crossed the Missouri River, the dome of the state capitol building came into view, gleaming in the distance like a beacon of hope. Sam felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite relief, not yet, but perhaps the first hint that the end of this ordeal was in sight. "Nearly there," she said, more to herself than to her passengers. But as they took the exit toward downtown Pierre, Sam's momentary optimism faded. In her rearview mirror, a police cruiser had appeared, its lights suddenly flashing as it accelerated to follow them. "We've got company," she said grimly, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Looks like our plan just got complicated." "Don't panic," Sam ordered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her system. In the rearview mirror, the police cruiser's lights pulsed with menacing regularity. "Everyone stay calm. We're close to the courthouse. If we can just get there, should we pull over?" Helen asked, her knuckles white as she gripped the door handle. Sam assessed their options rapidly. "Not yet. We're only 3 blocks from the courthouse. Judge Reeves might already be there." Thomas curled into himself in the back seat, his face pale with fear. "What if Frank called them? What if they're here to arrest you, Sam?" "Then we'll deal with it," Sam replied, her jaw set with determination. "Remember, we have evidence. We have the truth. That has to count for something." She maintained a steady speed, neither accelerating nor stopping, as the courthouse came into view at the end of the street. The police cruiser stayed behind them, lights flashing, but surprisingly, no siren. Something about that detail nagged at Sam's instincts. As they pulled up to the courthouse steps, Sam made a decision. "Helen, take Thomas and the documents inside. Find Judge Reeves, I'll deal with the officer." Helen hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Sam to face potential arrest alone. "But no arguments," Sam cut her off. "Thomas's safety comes first. Always. Go. Now." The police cruiser pulled up behind them as Sam parked the Buick in front of the courthouse. Helen and Thomas quickly exited the vehicle, Thomas casting one frightened glance back at Sam before his grandmother ushered him up the courthouse steps. Sam took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her hands visible, her posture deliberately non-threatening as she turned to face the approaching officer. To her surprise, it was a female state trooper, middle-aged with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," the trooper said, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. Sam nodded, moving slowly as she reached for her wallet. "Officer, I can explain the situation." "I'm sure you can," the trooper interrupted. Examining the driver's license, Sam handed over. "Samantha Rivera, we received an alert about you." Sam's stomach dropped. "An alert?" The trooper's expression remained impassive. "A bolo for a suspected kidnapping. Boy about 12 years old, taken by a female truck driver." Her gaze flicked to the courthouse where Helen and Thomas had disappeared inside. "That the boy?" "It's not what you think," Sam said quickly. "The boy's stepfather has been abusing him. We're here to meet Judge Reeves and file formal charges. The boy's grandmother is with him. She has documentation of the abuse and financial fraud." The trooper studied Sam's face, her expression giving nothing away. "Judge Michael Reeves?" "Yes," Sam confirmed. "He's expecting us. Please check with him before you do anything. The boy's safety depends on it." A long moment passed as the trooper seemed to weigh her options. Finally, she handed back Sam's license. "Wait here, don't move." She returned to her cruiser and picked up her radio, speaking words Sam couldn't hear. The minutes stretched like hours as Sam stood beside the Buick, her mind racing through possible escape routes if things went south. She could make a run for the courthouse, try to find Helen and Thomas, but that might only make the situation worse. Finally, the trooper emerged from her vehicle and approached Sam again. "Judge Reeves confirms he's expecting you. Says he vouches for your character." Her expression softened slightly. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but if a sitting judge is involved, I'm inclined to let the system work." She gestured toward the courthouse. "Go on in, but don't leave town without checking in with the state police." "This isn't over." Relief washed over Sam. "Thank you. We won't." The trooper nodded once, then returned to her cruiser. She didn't drive away, Sam noticed, but parked across the street, maintaining a watchful presence. Sam hurried up the courthouse steps, pushing through the heavy doors into the marble-floored lobby. A security checkpoint blocked the way forward, and Sam quickly explained her situation to the guards, who directed her to courtroom C on the second floor. The courtroom was smaller than Sam had expected, intimate almost, with polished wood furnishings and tall windows that filled the space with natural light. Helen and Thomas sat in the front row, alongside an elderly man with silver hair and the dignified bearing of a longtime jurist, Judge Reeves presumably. Two other individuals sat nearby. A woman in a smart business suit who had the focused look of a social worker, and a man in plain clothes with the unmistakable posture of law enforcement. Sam slipped into the row behind them, and Helen turned with visible relief. "Thank God, we were worried when we saw the police car." "It's okay," Sam assured her. The trooper checked with Judge Reeves. "We're clear for now." The silver-haired man turned, extending his hand to Sam. "Ms. Rivera, Michael Reeves. Helen's told me what you did for Thomas. Andrew would have been proud." Sam shook his hand, struck by the man's resemblance to an older version of Andrew Miller. There was something about the eyes, the set of the jaw. "I just did what anyone would do." Judge Reeves raised an eyebrow. "We both know that's not true." He gestured to the others. "This is Jessica Morales from Child Protective Services and Detective Brian Hawkins from the State Police. They've agreed to hear Thomas's statement and review the evidence in an informal setting before we file formal charges." Detective Hawkins leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Ms. Rivera, I understand you found the boy in Nebraska. We'll need your statement as well." Sam nodded, taking a seat beside Helen. "Of course." whatever helps Thomas. For the next hour, the small group remained in the courtroom as Thomas, with occasional support from Helen and Sam, recounted the abuse he had suffered at Frank's hands. The detective took detailed notes, while Ms. Morales asked gentle, clarifying questions, her expression growing increasingly concerned. Helen presented the financial documents she had brought, laying out the evidence of Frank's misappropriation of Andrew's military benefits. Detective Hawkins examined them carefully, occasionally consulting with Judge Reeves about legal particulars. "These bank statements are damning," Hawkins said finally. "Clear evidence of funds being diverted, combined with Thomas's testimony and the visible injuries." He looked up at Thomas. "I believe we have enough to open a formal investigation and file for an emergency protection order." "What about custody?" Helen asked anxiously. "Frank is still legally Thomas's guardian." Ms. Morales interjected, "Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to recommend immediate temporary custody be granted to you, Mrs. Miller, pending the outcome of the investigation. Thomas clearly feels safe with you, and as his biological grandmother, you have a strong case." The relief on Helen's face was palpable, matched by the tentative hope blooming in Thomas's eyes. For the first time since Sam had found him, the boy looked as though he truly believed he might be safe. Judge Reeves nodded approvingly. "I'll sign the temporary custody order immediately. Now, about Frank Ellison," the courtroom doors burst open with a bang, cutting off the judge's words. Sam spun around, her body tensing instantly as Frank Ellison himself stormed into the courtroom, his face contorted with rage. Behind him, a flustered security guard called, "Sir, you can't go in there without clearance." Frank ignored him, his gaze locking on Thomas with furious intensity. "There you are, you little liar," he spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The trouble you've caused?" Sam was on her feet in an instant, positioning herself between Frank and Thomas. Detective Hawkins moved just as quickly, his hand going to the weapon at his hip. "Mr. Ellison, I presume? I'm going to need you to step back and calm down." Frank's gaze shifted to the detective, recognition flickering in his eyes. His posture changed subtly, some of the naked aggression bleeding away as his police training asserted itself. "Detective, there's been a misunderstanding. My stepson ran away, took my car. This woman," he jabbed a finger at Sam, "essentially kidnapped him. I've been worried sick." "That's not what the evidence suggests, Mr. Ellison," Hawkins replied evenly. "We were just reviewing some very concerning financial records and testimony from Thomas." Frank's expression tightened, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "Whatever Thomas told you, it's not true. He's been troubled since his mother died, acting out, making up stories." His gaze slid to Helen, hardening. "And I'm sure his grandmother has been filling his head with nonsense. She's never accepted my role in his life." Helen stood slowly, her slight frame somehow imposing in her quiet dignity. "The only thing I've filled his head with is the truth about his father, the man you've been stealing from even after death." Frank took a menacing step forward, but Detective Hawkins moved to block his path. "Mr. Ellison, I need you to back up now. You're not helping your case." "My case?" Frank scoffed. "There is no case. This is a family matter that's gotten out of hand because this old woman couldn't accept that Julia chose me, not her, to raise her son." "Julia didn't know what you'd become," Helen replied, her voice steady despite the tension vibrating through the room. "She didn't know you'd use her son as a meal ticket, collecting Andrew's benefits while Thomas went hungry." Frank's face darkened with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about. You have no proof?" Actually, Mr. Ellison, we do have proof, Judge Reeves interjected, holding up the financial documents. Quite compelling proof, in fact. And given Thomas's injuries and testimony, there's more than enough evidence to warrant a formal investigation. For a moment, Frank seemed to deflate, the reality of his situation sinking in. Then, with a sudden burst of desperate energy, he lunged toward Thomas, shoving past Sam. "You little—" He never finished the sentence. Sam's military training kicked in instantly. She pivoted, using Frank's own momentum against him, and swept his legs out from under him. He hit the courtroom floor hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. Detective Hawkins was on him in seconds, knee in his back, handcuffs clicking into place. "Frank Ellison, you're under arrest for assault and battery of a minor, financial fraud, and now attempted assault in a courtroom. You have the right to remain silent." As Hawkins continued reading Frank his rights, Sam turned to check on Thomas. The boy was shaking, but there was something like vindication in his eyes as he watched his stepfather being subdued. Helen had her arm around him, holding him close. "It's over, Tommy," she whispered. "It's really over." Sam wasn't so sure. Legal. Proceedings were rarely this clean or simple, but for the moment at least, Thomas was safe. Frank was in custody. The truth was coming to light. Detective Hawkins hauled Frank to his feet, the former police officer now subdued, his earlier bravado replaced by cold calculation as he assessed his options. His gaze fell on Sam, hatred burning in his eyes. "You've made a big mistake," he hissed, as Hawkins began leading him away. "This isn't over." Sam met his stare unflinchingly. "For Thomas it is. That's all that matters." As the detective escorted Frank from the courtroom, Ms. Morales approached Thomas with a gentle smile. "You were very brave today. I know this wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Thomas nodded, leaning into his grandmother's embrace. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Judge Reeves stepped forward. "Now you go home with your grandmother. Ms. Morales will check in regularly to make sure you're settling in okay. There will be more statements to make, probably a trial eventually, but that's for later." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "For now, focus on healing." Thomas looked up at Sam, a question in his eyes. "And Sam? What about her?" The question hung in the air. Sam hadn't thought that far ahead. Her life was on the road, always moving, never staying in one place too long. What place did she have in Thomas's future? Helen reached out, taking Sam's hand in her own. "Sam is family now," she said firmly. "She'll always have a place with us, whenever she's passing through. Family." The word stirred something deep within Sam, a longing she'd buried years ago when she'd left the military, when she'd lost the camaraderie that had defined her life for so long. "I'd like that," she said softly, surprising herself with how much. She meant it. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the courtroom, Thomas suddenly turned to Sam. "Dad would have really liked you," he said. "Not just because you saved me, because you're like him. You don't look away when things get hard." Sam felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Your dad was the best man I ever served with. Having you safe, knowing his son is going to be okay, that matters more than anything." Together, the three of them walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight. The state trooper who had pulled them over earlier stood by her cruiser, watching as they emerged. She nodded once to Sam, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect, before driving away. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be legal battles, healing to be done, trust to rebuild. But as they stood on the courthouse steps, temporary guardianship papers in Helen's hands and Frank in custody, Sam felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. The certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Sometimes the most unexpected detours lead us exactly where we're meant to go. For Sam Rivera, a chance encounter on a dark highway had brought her full circle, connecting her once again to the man who had saved her life through the son she had in turn saved. The debt was paid, but the journey was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation in the Pierre courthouse. The golden plains of South Dakota had begun their transition to autumn, the tall grasses taking on amber hues as the nights grew cooler. For Sam Rivera, the changing season mirrored the transformation in her own life. She stood in Helen Miller's backyard, watching as Thomas carefully watered the tomato plants that his grandmother had taught him to tend. The bruise on his temple had faded to a barely visible yellow shadow, but Sam knew that the invisible wounds would take much longer to heal. Still, there were hopeful signs. Thomas smiled more often now. He slept through the night without nightmares, at least most of the time. And yesterday he had laughed, really laughed, when Sam had told him about the time his father had accidentally set fire to their tent during a training exercise in Germany. "He's doing better," Helen said softly, joining Sam by the fence. She handed her a mug of coffee, steam rising in the crisp morning air. "Having you here has helped more than you know." Sam accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. She hadn't planned to stay in Rapid City this long. Her original intention had been to ensure Thomas and Helen were settled safely, then return to her life on the road. But as days turned into weeks, she found herself reluctant to leave. Her trucking company had been surprisingly understanding when she requested an extended leave of absence, though the fact that Judge Reeves had personally called the company president might have had something to do with their flexibility. "He's a strong kid," Sam replied, watching as Thomas moved to the raspberry bushes, inspecting the late-season fruit with careful attention, like his father. Helen's eyes crinkled at the corners, though whether from her smile or unshed tears, Sam couldn't tell. "Yes, very much like Andrew." She paused, sipping her coffee before adding, "The prosecutor called this morning while you were in the shower." Sam turned to her, instantly alert. "And?" Frank's being held without bail. The financial fraud evidence was too compelling for the judge to consider release. And when they executed the search warrant on his house, Helen's voice faltered. They found more documentation, not just about Tommy's benefits, other families too. Sam's stomach clenched. "Other families? What do you mean?" Apparently, this wasn't the first time Frank had targeted a widow with benefits. Helen's voice was tight with controlled anger. The prosecutor said there were at least 3 other women before Julia, all military widows with children, all with significant survivor benefits or insurance payouts. "Son of a bitch," Sam muttered, her grip tightening on the mug. "He was hunting them, deliberately." Helen nodded grimly. The detective believes he was using his position as a police officer to identify vulnerable families. The prosecutor is reaching out to the other victims now. With multiple cases, he says Frank is looking at a minimum of 15 years. A cold satisfaction settled in Sam's chest. Not long enough, in her opinion, but at least Frank would pay for what he'd done. Does Thomas know? Not the details. just that Frank will be going away for a very long time. Helen glanced toward her grandson, who was now collecting ripe raspberries in a small basket. I didn't want to burden him with more ugly truths. He's had enough of those. Sam understood. Thomas needed to heal, to remember that the world contained good things as well as bad. That trust was possible, even after betrayal. The custody hearing is next Thursday, Helen continued. Miss Morales says it's practically a formality at this point. With Frank in custody and facing multiple felony charges, there's no one contesting my petition. That's good, Sam said. Thomas belongs here with you. Helen smiled, though there was something wistful in her expression. And what about you, Sam? What comes next for you? The question caught Sam off guard, though she'd been asking herself. The same thing for days. Her leave of absence wouldn't last forever. Eventually, she would need to make a decision, return to the road or find something new. I'm not sure yet, she admitted. I've been driving for so long I don't know what else I'd do, but, Helen prompted gently. Before Sam could answer, Thomas approached, his basket half filled with berries. Look what I found, Grandma! He exclaimed, proudly displaying his harvest. Enough for pancakes, like you promised. Helen's face lit up with genuine delight. Perfect. Why don't you take them inside and rinse them while I finish talking with Sam? Thomas nodded eagerly, then hesitated, looking at Sam with sudden concern. You're not leaving today, are you? The vulnerability in his voice made Sam's chest ache. Not today, buddy. I'm here at least through your custody hearing next week. Relief washed over his face. Good, because I still need to show you my dad's baseball card collection. Grandma found it in the attic yesterday. Sam smiled. I wouldn't miss that for the world. Seemingly satisfied, Thomas headed inside with his berry harvest, leaving the two women in companionable silence for a moment. He's attached to you, Helen observed quietly. I haven't seen him connect with an adult like this since before Julia got sick. Sam sighed, leaning against the fence post. I know. That's part of what makes this complicated. I care about him, too, more than I expected to. But my life, my job, I'm not exactly stable mother material. Helen's eyebrow arched. Who said anything about being his mother? Thomas had a mother who loved him very much. What he needs now are people in his corner. Family doesn't always look the way we expect it to, Sam. The words resonated with Sam in a way she hadn't anticipated. Family. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to think in those terms. After leaving the military, she had deliberately chosen a solitary life, finding comfort in the anonymity of endless highways and changing landscapes. No attachments meant no pain when those attachments inevitably broke. But Thomas and Helen had somehow slipped past her defenses, creating connections she hadn't planned for but couldn't bring herself to sever. The regional dispatch center is hiring, Sam found herself saying, the words surprising her as much as Helen. For the trucking company. It's here in Rapid City. I saw the posting online last night. Helen's eyes brightened with understanding. A dispatch position? You'd be using your knowledge of the roads, the industry, but staying in one place, Sam finished. I've got the experience. My supervisor already said he'd give me a recommendation if I wanted it. And do you want it? Sam looked toward the house where Thomas could be seen through the kitchen window, carefully washing his berries at the sink. I'm thinking about it. It would be a change, a big one. Helen smiled knowingly. Change isn't always a bad thing. Before Sam could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew their attention. Sam tensed instinctively. a habit, formed over the past weeks of vigilance, but relaxed when she recognized Judge Reeves's sedan. "I forgot to mention," Helen said, looking slightly guilty. "Michael is coming for breakfast. He's bringing some papers for me to sign before the custody hearing." Sam nodded, though she suspected there was more to the judge's visit than just paperwork. She had noticed the way he looked at Helen, the frequency of his calls and visits over the past weeks. There was clearly history there, and possibly a future as well. Judge Reeves emerged from his car, casually dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt, rather than his usual courtroom attire. He carried a manila envelope in one hand and a bakery box in the other. When he spotted them in the backyard, he changed direction, circling around to the garden gate. "Good morning, ladies," he called cheerfully. "Helen, your roses are looking magnificent this year." Helen's cheeks took on a subtle pink hue that had nothing to do with the morning chill. "Thank you, Michael. They've been unusually vibrant this fall." The judge turned to Sam, extending the bakery box. "I brought cinnamon rolls from Johnson's Bakery. Thomas mentioned they were your favorite when I saw him at the diner yesterday." Sam accepted the box, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you. They are, actually. Judge Reeves has been checking in on us regularly," Helen explained, though the slight defensive note in her voice told Sam this was more than a simple professional concern. "Please, it's just Michael when we're not in the courthouse," he insisted. "And speaking of the courthouse, I have those guardianship pre-filing forms for you to sign, Helen." He patted the manila envelope. "Just a formality, but it'll speed things up on Thursday." The kitchen door banged open as Thomas bounded onto the porch. "Judge Reeves, did you bring the thing? The one you showed me yesterday?" Michael's eyes twinkled with mischief. "I might have. It's in the car. Why don't you come help me get it?" As Thomas eagerly followed the judge back to his sedan, Sam gave Helen a quizzical look. "The thing?" Helen sighed, though she was smiling. "Michael found some of Andrew's old belongings in his attic. Apparently, Andrew stored some boxes there. Before his final deployment, Michael has been bringing them over a few at a time." Her voice softened with emotion. "It's been good for Thomas, having these tangible connections to his father." Sam watched as Michael opened his trunk and handed Thomas a small box, the boy's face lighting up with excitement as he peered inside. Something in her chest constricted at the scene. This intergenerational bond, this community rallying around. A child who had lost so much. "I think I'm going to apply for that dispatch position," she said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "Today?" Helen looked at her, genuine pleasure spreading across her features. "Really? You're sure?" Sam nodded, surprising herself with how right the decision felt. "Yeah, I'm sure. I can't promise I'll stay forever. I don't know if I'm cut out for putting down roots, but I want to try for a while at least." Helen squeezed her arm gently. "That's all any of us can do, Sam. Try, one day at a time." Thomas came running back, to them, clutching a battered shoebox. "Sam, look what Judge Reeves found. Dad's old army stuff." He set the box on the porch table and carefully removed the lid, revealing a collection of military memorabilia, patches, medals, a worn compass, and a stack of faded photographs. Thomas picked up one of the photos and handed it to Sam. "That's you," he said, pointing to a younger version of Sam standing next to his father outside a tent, both in desert camouflage, both grinning despite the visible exhaustion in their eyes. Sam took the photograph with trembling fingers. She remembered when it was taken, 3 days before the IED explosion that had taken Andrew's life. They had just completed a successful supply run to a remote outpost, navigating terrain considered too dangerous for most convoy teams. The photo captured a rare moment of camaraderie and triumph. "Your dad kept this?" she asked, her voice rough. With emotion, Thomas nodded. "There are lots of pictures of his squad. He wrote stuff on the back of some of them." Sam turned the photo over, her heart catching at the sight of Andrew's familiar handwriting. "Rivera, best driver in the battalion. Wouldn't trust anyone else with the wheel when it matters." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Sam quickly wiped it away, but not before Thomas noticed. "Are you sad?" he asked, looking concerned. Sam shook her head, smiling through the emotion. "No, buddy, not sad, just remembering. Your dad was special, one of the good ones." Thomas nodded solemnly. "That's what Grandma says too." He hesitated, then asked in a smaller voice, "Do you think he'd be proud of me for telling the truth about Frank?" The vulnerability in the question broke Sam's heart all over again. She knelt down to Thomas's level, looking him directly in the eyes. "Thomas, your father would be more than proud. He'd be in awe of your courage. It takes a special kind of bravery to stand up for the truth when it's hard. Your dad had that kind of courage, and so do you." Thomas's eyes glistened, but he didn't cry. Instead, he threw his arms around Sam's neck in a fierce hug. Over his shoulder, Sam saw Helen and Michael exchange a meaningful glance, both smiling. At the scene before them, "All right," Helen announced, breaking the emotional moment with practiced grace. "Those raspberries aren't going to turn themselves into pancakes. Who's hungry?" The kitchen soon became a hub of cheerful activity. Thomas appointed himself as Helen's official assistant, measuring flour and stirring batter with earnest concentration. Michael set the table, moving with the ease of someone familiar with the space, and Sam found herself folding into this improvised family gathering with surprising naturalness, helping where needed, laughing at Michael's dry jokes, feeling more at home than she had in years. As they sat down to breakfast, the conversation flowed easily, touching on the custody hearing, Thomas's upcoming return to school, and local news. Not once did they discuss Frank or the ongoing legal proceedings against him. That shadow would always be part of their story, but it needn't darken every moment of their present. "So, Sam," Michael said during a lull in the conversation, "Helen mentioned you might be staying in Rapid City for a while?" Sam nodded, catching Thomas's hopeful expression from across the table. "That's the plan. The dispatch center has an opening. I'm going to apply today." Thomas nearly bounced out of his chair with excitement. "Really? You're staying?" "Let's see. If I get the job first," Sam cautioned, though she couldn't help smiling at his enthusiasm. "But yes, I'm planning to stick around." "You'll get it," Michael said confidently. "I happen to know the regional manager pretty well, former Army himself, appreciates veterans." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Judge, are you offering to put in a good word?" Michael spread his hands innocently. "Just offering to make an introduction. The rest would be up to you." Helen shot him an admonishing look, but there was affection beneath it. "Michael believes in using his connections for good causes. A side benefit of 40 years in public service," he agreed, unrepentant. "You get to know people." As breakfast concluded and Thomas began helping Helen clear the dishes, Michael drew Sam aside. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "What you did for Thomas, stepping in when you had every reason to just keep driving. It was extraordinary." Sam shook her head. It wasn't extraordinary. It was the only decent option. "That's where you're wrong," Michael replied. "Most people would have called 911 and continued on their way, content that they'd done their duty. You went above and beyond. You put yourself at risk for a child you didn't know because of a connection to a man who died saving you years ago." He smiled gently. "In my book, that's the definition of extraordinary." Sam felt uncomfortable under the weight of his praise. "I just did what Andrew would have done." "Exactly," Michael said, as if she'd made his point for him. "And now you're choosing to stay, to be part of Thomas's life going forward. That's not an obligation. It's a gift to him and to Helen." He glanced toward the kitchen where grandmother and grandson were washing dishes together, their movements synchronized by growing familiarity. "And perhaps to yourself as well." Before Sam could respond, Thomas called from the kitchen. "Sam, can you help me dry? Grandma says I'm still too short to reach the top shelves." "Duty calls," Michael said with a wink, stepping back so Sam could join Thomas at the sink. As she took the dish towel from Thomas's outstretched hand, Sam felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over her. The road had been her home for so long. The endless ribbon of highway stretching toward the horizon, the solitude of the truck cab, the freedom to leave any place without looking back. She had chosen that life deliberately, finding safety in constant motion. But sometimes, she reflected as Thomas handed her a plate to dry, standing still took more courage than moving on. Sometimes the real journey wasn't measured in miles logged or states crossed, but in the connections formed along the way. Sam didn't know what the future held. The dispatch job might work out or it might not. She might stay in Rapid City for months or years. There would be challenges ahead, Thomas's healing journey, the legal proceedings against Frank, her own adjustment to a more rooted existence. But as she looked around at this improvised family, Helen with her quiet strength, Michael with his principled kindness, and Thomas with his resilient spirit, Sam knew one thing with certainty. Whatever road lay ahead, she wouldn't be traveling it alone, and for now that was enough. 6 months had passed since that fateful night on the Nebraska highway. Winter had descended upon Rapid City, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wonderland of snow-draped pines and ice-glazed streets. Sam Rivera stood at the window of her small apartment, watching as fat snowflakes drifted lazily from a pewter sky. She cradled a mug of coffee in her hands, savoring the warmth that seeped through her palms. The dispatch center had hired her almost immediately after her interview, impressed by her extensive knowledge of routes and her ability to anticipate the challenges drivers faced on the road. Sam had adapted to the position more easily than she'd expected, discovering that she had a talent for coordinating logistics and solving problems on the fly. She still missed driving sometimes, the solitude, the changing scenery, the sense of constant motion. But the stability of her new life offered compensations she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with a text from Helen. "Don't forget, Thomas's holiday concert tonight at 7. He has a solo." Sam smiled, typing a quick response. "Wouldn't miss it. Want me to pick up Michael on the way?" 3 dots appeared. Then Helen's reply. "He's picking me up, actually. See you there." The relationship between Helen and Judge Reeves had blossomed over the past months, transitioning from long-time friendship to something deeper. Thomas had been delighted by this development, declaring that Grandma deserves to be happy too. Sam agreed wholeheartedly. After years of being kept at arm's length from her grandson, Helen deserved every happiness life could offer. Sam glanced at the clock and finished her coffee. She had the morning shift at the dispatch center today, coordinating routes for 18 drivers navigating winter conditions across 5 states. The work was demanding but satisfying, requiring a blend of technical knowledge, problem-solving skills, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. As she prepared to leave, Sam's gaze fell on the framed photograph now sitting on her bookshelf, the one Thomas had found in Andrew's belongings. She had made a copy for herself, returning the original to Thomas's growing collection of mementos. The image of her younger self standing beside Andrew Miller remained a powerful reminder of why she had stayed in Rapid City, of the unexpected ways the past could shape the present. The dispatch center hummed with focused activity when Sam arrived, multiple dispatchers monitoring screens showing truck locations, weather patterns, and delivery schedules. Sam settled at her station, donning her headset and logging into the system. Immediately, a flurry of notifications greeted her. 2 trucks delayed by black ice in Wyoming, a jackknifed semi blocking a crucial interchange in Montana, a driver reporting engine trouble near the North Dakota border. "Morning, Rivera," called Diane Jeffries, the center supervisor. "Got a situation brewing in the Bighorns. Storm system moving in faster than predicted. We've got 3 rigs heading that way." Sam nodded, already pulling up the relevant routes and driver information. "On it. I'll get them rerouted." She spent the next hour in rapid communication with the affected drivers, calculating alternative paths and coordinating with local highway patrols for the latest road condition updates. It was the kind of high-pressure situation she excelled at, requiring quick thinking and decisive action. "Nice work," Diane commented, as the last of the threatened deliveries was safely rerouted. "Those drivers are lucky to have you on this end of the radio." Sam accepted the compliment with a nod, though privately she knew the truth was more complicated. She understood what those drivers were facing because she had been in their position countless times, battling treacherous conditions, racing against deadlines, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The rest of her shift passed in a similar rhythm of problem-solving and coordination. By the time Sam clocked out at 3, she felt the particular satisfaction that came from navigating challenges successfully. It wasn't the same adrenaline rush as personally driving through a blizzard, but it carried its own rewards. As she drove toward her apartment through the steadily falling snow, Sam's phone rang. The caller ID showed Marjorie Winters, a name Sam didn't immediately recognize. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Rivera, this is Marjorie Winters from the Veterans Affairs Office in Sioux Falls. Judge Reeves suggested I contact you." Sam's brow furrowed. "Yes, this is Sam Rivera. How can I help?" "You. I understand you served with Staff Sergeant Andrew Miller in Afghanistan, and that you've been assisting his son and mother-in-law?" "That's right," Sam confirmed, pulling into a parking space outside her building so she could focus on the call. "I'm calling because your actions appear to have uncovered a larger pattern of fraud targeting veterans' families," Marjorie explained. "The investigation into Frank Ellison led us to discover similar cases across 3 states. We're now working with the FBI on what appears to be an organized scheme." Sam's grip tightened on the phone. "Organized? You mean Frank wasn't working alone?" "It seems not," Marjorie replied grimly. "We've identified a network of individuals, some in law enforcement, some in local VA offices, even a few funeral directors, who have been targeting vulnerable military families for years." They identify recently widowed spouses with substantial benefits, then position themselves to gain control of those finances. A cold anger settled in Sam's chest. How many families are we talking about? At least 27 confirmed cases. So far, dating back nearly a decade, the total amount stolen exceeds $4 million. Marjorie paused. The reason I'm calling is that we're organizing a support group for the affected families, and we'd like you to speak at our first meeting next month. Your perspective as both a veteran and someone who helped expose this fraud would be invaluable. Sam hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of public speaking. I'm not sure what I could offer. I just happened to find Thomas that night. It was luck, not some grand plan. Sometimes the most important actions start with being in the right place at the right time, Marjorie countered. But what you did afterward, protecting Thomas, helping gather evidence, standing up to Frank, that wasn't luck. That was courage. These families need to hear that kind of story right now. After a moment's consideration, Sam agreed to at least think about it. Marjorie promised to email her more details about the support group and ended the call with sincere thanks. Sam sat in her car for several minutes after the call ended, processing this new information. What had begun as one man's greed and cruelty had expanded into something far more sinister, a coordinated effort to prey on those already suffering from the loss of loved ones who had served their country. The thought made her physically ill, but there was a strange comfort too, in knowing that Thomas's ordeal hadn't been isolated, that in helping him, she had inadvertently helped dozens of other families get justice and possibly recover stolen funds. The ripple effects of that night on the highway continued to spread outward in ways she never could have anticipated. By the time Sam entered her apartment, the snow was falling more heavily, great white curtains obscuring the view from her windows. She changed out of her work clothes and spent the next couple of hours responding to emails, paying bills, and preparing a casserole to bring to Helen's house after Thomas's concert. Domestic tasks that would have seemed impossibly boring during her years on the road now provided a welcome rhythm to her days. At 6:30, Sam bundled up against the winter chill and headed to her car. The middle school auditorium was only a 10-minute drive from her apartment, but she wanted to arrive early to secure good seats. Thomas had been practicing his solo for weeks, his initial reluctance to join the school choir gradually transforming into genuine enthusiasm as his confidence grew. The school parking lot was already filling with parents and family members when Sam arrived, their vehicles forming dark islands in a sea of white. Inside the warmly lit auditorium, she spotted Helen and Michael in the third row, saving a seat with a program. Helen waved her over, her face alight with grandmotherly pride. "He's so nervous," Helen whispered as Sam settled beside her. "He changed his shirt 3 times before we left." Sam smiled, imagining Thomas fussing over his appearance. "He'll be great. Kid's got more courage than he realizes." Michael, distinguished as always even in casual attire, leaned forward. "Have you heard from Marjorie Winters yet? I gave her your number this morning." Sam nodded. "Just talk to her. FBI investigation, 27 families affected. It's bigger than we thought." Michael's expression grew solemn. "Much bigger. The U.S. Attorney's Office is preparing RICO charges against the ringleaders. Frank Ellison was just a foot soldier in their operation, it seems." Before they could discuss it further, the lights dimmed, and the choir director stepped onto the stage to welcome the audience. The concert began with the full choir performing winter-themed selections, the children's voices filling the auditorium with sweet, sometimes slightly off-key harmony. Then came the moment they'd been waiting for. The choir director announced, "Our next piece features a solo by 7th grader Thomas Miller." Thomas stepped forward from the back row, his face pale but determined in the spotlight. For a heartbeat, he looked terrified, his eyes scanning the audience until he located his grandmother, Judge Reeves, and Sam. Helen gave him a subtle thumbs up, and Sam nodded encouragingly. Something in the boy's posture shifted. He stood straighter, his chin lifting as the piano introduction began. And then he sang, a clear, pure tenor that held not a trace of the fear that had been so evident moments before. The simple Christmas carol took on unexpected depth in his youthful voice, each note imbued with genuine feeling. Sam felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the transformation happening on stage. This was the same boy she had found unconscious and freezing beside a gas station 6 months ago, now standing tall before a crowded auditorium, his voice soaring with newfound confidence. The journey from that night to this moment hadn't been easy or straightforward, but the results were nothing short of miraculous. When Thomas finished his solo, rejoining the choir for the final chorus, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Helen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and even Michael looked suspiciously misty. Sam clapped until her hands hurt, a fierce pride swelling in her chest. After the concert, they waited in the lobby for Thomas to emerge from backstage. When he finally appeared, still in his choir uniform of white shirt and black pants, Sam was struck by how much he had changed in 6 months. He stood taller, his face had lost its pinched, anxious look, and his eyes held a brightness that spoke of healing and hope. "You were amazing!" Helen exclaimed, embracing him. "Absolutely perfect!" Thomas blushed but couldn't hide his pleased smile. "I messed up one note in the middle. Did you hear it?" "Not a single mistake registered with this audience," Michael assured him, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You've got a real gift, Thomas." Then it was Sam's turn. She had never been demonstrative by nature, but something about Thomas had always bypassed her usual reserve. She hugged him briefly but firmly. "Your dad would have been bursting with pride," she said quietly. "I know I was." Thomas's smile wobbled slightly. "You think so? About my dad, I mean." "I know so," Sam replied. "He loved music, used to sing all the time in the barracks, drove everyone crazy, but he had a good voice, like you." This detail about his father, one of the many small memories Sam had been sharing over the months, seemed to mean more to Thomas than all the other compliments combined. His expression softened into something like wonder. "Mrs. Keller said I should join the select choir next semester," he confided. "They perform at competitions and everything." "That's wonderful news," Helen said, beaming with pride. "We'll have to celebrate. How about that new pizza place on Oak Street?" As they made their way through the crowded lobby toward the exit, a woman stepped into their path. For a split second, Sam tensed, her protective instincts kicking in, but the woman's smile was warm, if hesitant. "Excuse me," she said. "You're Thomas's family, right? I'm Diane Horvath, Jason's mom." She gestured toward a boy waiting nearby, clearly embarrassed by his mother's social initiative. "I just wanted to say how much Jason has enjoyed having Thomas in his study group. He's been such a positive influence." Helen introduced herself, graciously, clearly pleased by this unexpected praise. As the parents chatted, Thomas and Jason exchanged the awkward acknowledgements of middle school boys forced into social interaction by their elders. Watching the ordinary scene unfold, Sam was struck by how normal it all was. A school concert, parental pride, the tentative formation of friendships. After the trauma and drama of the past year, Thomas was gradually reclaiming the ordinary. Experiences of childhood, one small step at a time. Later, over pizza and sodas, the conversation flowed easily among the four of them, touching on school projects, Michael's retirement plans, Helen's garden club, and Sam's work at the dispatch center. Thomas, animated by his success at the concert, talked more than usual, describing his science teacher's failed experiment that had set off the fire alarm the previous week. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said suddenly, reaching into his backpack. "I got my history test back today." He pulled out a paper with a bold red A at the top. First A of the semester. Helen examined the test with obvious pride. "This is excellent, Tommy. And on the Revolutionary War unit that was giving you so much trouble." Thomas nodded, glancing at Sam. "I used that strategy you told me about, the one your sergeant taught you. Making up stories to connect all the dates and people." Sam smiled, remembering how she had shared that memorization trick with him during one of their weekly study sessions. It had been Andrew's technique originally, one he had taught all the new recruits struggling to remember complex protocols and procedures. "Works every time," she assured him. "Your dad used to say if you can turn facts into a story, your brain hangs on to them better." The evening concluded with plans for the weekend. A Saturday matinee of the new superhero movie Thomas had been eager to see, followed by dinner at Helen's. As they gathered their coats and headed out into the snowy night, Sam reflected on how thoroughly her life had changed in half a year. The solitary existence she had cultivated for so long had been replaced by this intricate web of relationships and responsibilities. There were weekly dinners at Helen's house, study sessions with Thomas, coffee meetings with Michael to discuss Thomas's legal matters, holiday gatherings, school events, impromptu weekend activities. A life built not around movement and distance, but around connection and presence. Driving home through the gently falling snow, Sam wondered what Andrew would think of all this. Would he be surprised that his tough, independent convoy driver had settled into such a domestic routine? Or would he recognize that she had finally found what had been missing in her life since leaving the military? A sense of belonging, of purpose, beyond the next delivery, the next destination. Sam's apartment welcomed her with quiet warmth when she returned. She shed her coat and boots, made a cup of tea, and settled on her small couch with a book she'd been trying to finish for weeks. The snow continued to fall outside her window, muffling the sounds of the city, creating a cocoon of peaceful silence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Thanks for coming tonight. Having you there helped me be brave." Sam smiled, typing back, "You were brave all on your own. I just got to witness it. Sleep well, buddy." As she set the phone down, Sam's gaze drifted to the photograph of her and Andrew again. In the months since finding it among his belongings, she had often wondered about the cosmic coincidence that had placed her on that specific stretch of highway on the precise night that Andrew's son needed help. What were the odds that of all the truckers who might have passed by, it would be the one who recognized his name, who owed his father a debt that could never be repaid? Some might call it fate or divine intervention. Sam preferred to think of it as Andrew's final act of service, guiding her to where she was needed most, ensuring his son wouldn't face his darkest hour alone. The debt would never be fully repaid. Andrew had given his life. Anything Sam could offer in return would always fall short of that ultimate sacrifice. But in helping Thomas heal, in becoming part of his extended family, in speaking up for other veteran families who had been victimized, perhaps she was honoring Andrew's memory in the most meaningful way possible. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white, nature's way of offering a fresh start. Sam sipped her tea and allowed herself to imagine for the first time in years a future defined not by what she was running from, but by what she was running toward. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges ahead. Thomas's adolescence, the ongoing legal proceedings, her own adjustment to a more settled existence. But the foundation had been laid for something she had never expected to find again after leaving the military. A life of purpose, connection, and belonging. The road that had brought her here had been long and winding, marked by loss and sacrifice. But as Sam Rivera sat in the quiet warmth of her apartment, surrounded by the small markers of her new life, she recognized that sometimes the most important journeys weren't measured in miles, but in the connections formed along the way. And for the first time in years, she was exactly where she needed to be. If this story touched your heart, don't let our connection end here. Stories like Sam and Thomas's remind us that even in our darkest moments, unexpected heroes can appear to guide us through. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of courage, connection, and the unbreakable bonds that form when strangers become family. Each week, we bring you true accounts of extraordinary kindness and the ripple effects that change lives forever. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our newest uploads. Your support allows us to continue sharing these inspiring journeys with the world. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, please share this video with them. Sometimes the right story at the right moment can make all the difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, remember that heroes walk among us every day, and sometimes they're driving 18-wheelers.